Okay. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Good week. Shavua Tov. This is Steve Warnick, Reb Steve, one of the rabbis here at Bet Tzedek Congregation in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, coming to you for our weekly conversations over coffee. I have my coffee. I hope you have yours. Rabbi Blumenthal, do you have yours?
I have my water.
You have your water.
So I'm ready to go.
You're ready to go. Okay.
My coffee was earlier.
My guest this morning is a good friend and colleague, and someone for whom I have much empathy with. That is Rabbi Jacob Blumenthal, who is the chief executive and the chief executive officer of both the Rabbinical Assembly of Conservative Rabbis Worldwide and USCJ, United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism, which is the network of conservative kihilot in North America. My former gig before I came to Bet Tzedek. It's really, Jacob, it's a pleasure to have you with us here today. A lot has changed in the last couple of years, both within the movement and within the world in which we live.
Yes.
Why don't we start tell us a little bit about you and your journey that you think led you to this place and this moment of rabbinic leadership.
First of all, it's wonderful to be together. And Steve, I think of you as a good friend as well, as in addition to being a wonderful colleague. And so it's just wonderful to spend time with you and to be able to share some thoughts today in this conversation. So first of all, just to thank you for the invitation, for being here. And yeah, this has been it has definitely been an interesting journey. I do not think this is where I thought I would be at this stage in my career. It was not something that I had thought would happen, but yet here we are. So, but and for better or worse, I'm actually a product of our movement. I love the fact that you're wearing the official colors on your sweatshirt, and because the fact is, I grew up here. I'm actually currently living outside Washington D.C., about 5 miles from where I grew up. And in addition to my family, actually, my experiences at USY were completely formative. It taught me a lot about leadership, about community. I went on, in addition to being a member of 2 chapters as a teenager growing up, including my home shul in Bethesda, Maryland, Bethel. I went on USY pilgrimage, and then I loved that so much. I went on Nativ for my first year of college, back when it was Nativ 4. My son ended up on Nativ 34. So,
and they're getting ready to celebrate their 40th anniversary now.
Yes,
so, right? Nativ 40 is around the corner.
It's the Nativ 40. So, so I got in on the ground floor, as I like to say. But those experiences, like they framed a lot about both of my experience of Jewish leadership, the idea of how peers build community. And they also framed a lot about how I think about Jewish leadership as a peer empowerment enterprise, like really thinking about how we help people form their own communities. The idea that I grew up with on Nativ was that we were responsible for forming our own community, to create our own activities, to create our own sense of what Shabbat looked like, our own sense of how we would act as a community. And I've used that since then in both, when I was a USY advisor in college, and then when I became a regional youth director after college. And so this is actually my second stint at USCJ.
Right.
And then
you were also
when I went into the
rabbinate, you were like an assistant USY director overall, if memory recalls.
I was the assistant, what they call the assistant international director. Also, so I worked at 155 Fifth Avenue. So, it's sort of like a big circle. But I've also used that a lot in my own rabbinate. Spent 20 years in what was at first a startup congregation here in Maryland. Also, again, thinking about how to help our lay people in our community sort of find its own way, create its own culture, think about how we wanted to create a modern synagogue and what that should look like. And so I've been using that in a lot of different spaces. And I really put a lot of that back into my USY experiences and the leadership I learned from there. So, my hope is that I can give that back. We can create the new structures that we need in the 21st century to help a next generation of leaders think about what community looks like, and how Judaism can be adapted and evolve to fit our needs today.
So let's go next to USY. I mean, obviously, I'm wearing this fleece for a couple of reasons. One is it's the most comfortable fleece I own, and I really like it. The second is that the logo was part of the way in which we unveiled the new branding for USCJ and for USY in particular. And then the third most important is, like USY has probably been the most formative element of my Jewish life, and not only the inspiration for living a meaningful Jewish life, but also the inspiration and leadership skills that I learned at that time as a kid and as an advisor, and subsequently remain with me. And yet, there's always the danger of USY in its glory days and USY today. It's a very different environment for young people. There's a lot more choices. And in some ways, I think the engagement with USY is related to the decline that we've experienced numerically within the conservative movement in the last decade plus. So, what are some of the things that Rabbi Josh Rabin is now the new international director of teen engagement and of USY, and he comes into it at a time of a pandemic where part of the strength of USY was always the convening and the being together. Tell us what's going on with USY, in general. I know that here in Canada, for example, EC it's a struggle. Part of that is the high number of day school students that are in this community. And then other it's related to some of those other issues. So share with us part of what USY is looking to do at this moment.
So first of all, I think a lot of as you said, many of the trends in USY reflect larger challenges that are facing synagogue life, in general. People also have more choices in terms of how they want to spend their time, what their Jewish choices are. People are not wedded to any one brand, so to speak, right? If they find a meaningful experience in one space, they will do that. And then if they find another meaningful experience or community in another space, they will move on to that space, as well. They don't feel like they need to be, only in one space within our ecosystem. So, and it's also part of having lots of different choices of how we do those experiences. So in synagogue life in general, for example, some things happen inside our buildings, some things happen Jewishly in our homes, some things happen in third spaces and coffee shops, things like that. And one of the things we're learning in coronavirus is that also things happen online in virtual space, in online spaces. And as a movement, we need to be thinking about all four of those spaces, and USY is no different. So for example, USY this summer innovated with what they called My USY Phi Summer. And we had hundreds of kids signing up and doing all sorts of things, from Talmud classes to juggling to college Hebrew. And I think that's going to be an area that grows. I think we're going to be able to find ways to bring USYers in an online space across the continent in ways that we might not have ever thought about doing. And like we're learning now with congregations, USY is going to have two areas of strength. One will be, and our movement has to think about, in what way are we strong online in these spaces? What will continue to be meaningful ways to learn or pray or advocate, have different Jewish experiences in a virtual space with people all across North America? And in what spaces do we need to be hyper-local, where only the in-person experience of the synagogue can really make an impact? For synagogues, that's probably around life cycle events. It's around intimate prayer experiences. It's around intimate Torah study, where you're really forming relationships. one-on-one, in small groups, whatever that is. There's a lot that our congregations have as a strength because they are so hyper-local. And we can create an ecosystem around that to support it, whether that's online or in larger program. USY I think, is looking at the same structure. Some of our program will move online. And then we're going to look at, for example, how can we create really strong programs within specific cities? We just got a grant, for example, that we're going to use in Atlanta to think about what would it mean for our synagogues in Atlanta to come together and to think about creating really strong both pre-USY Kadima programs and USY programs themselves, whether they're even labeled USY or not. But what does it mean? What are we, it's an experiment to think about really orienting things in a particular city and see if we can create a sense of strength and community, in that space. So very, very local, not even regional, but actually within a particular city. We're also looking at ways to enhance and strengthen what congregations do for teens. So how can we, for example, Rabbi Josh Rabin has created what we call a Sulam program, right? Those are all of our leadership programs, but a specific program really just to bring parents and other stakeholders in a congregation together to say, what if we were serious about teen engagement in our congregation? What would that look like? Can we create focus groups with teens? Can we create focus groups with parents to really learn about that and then figure out what is a teen experience in our congregation? In my congregation, for example, in Gaithersburg, it was less about weekly or monthly programs. It was more about drawing them in as tutors in our religious school, helpers at various synagogue events, and then really leveraging a lot of our regional programs for a lot of the social space that our teens needed. It's a fairly compact region, so those things happen more often and with a more regular set of people. Those are the kinds of things that we're exploring.
It would seem to me that whenever I have this conversation, I think of our colleague Rabbi Stephen Abraham in Omaha, Nebraska.
Mm-hmm.
Right. This is a shul that historically has had a very, very successful teen engagement program. It's the shul where Ron Wolfson grew up, for example. How the hyper focus stuff and everything works in the big cities. I would imagine that the online space would have to be in some ways targeted specifically for those communities that are in the Midwest and in some of the more isolated Jewish communities throughout North America.
Well, first of all, one of the things I've learned, in my own work is that in many of our smaller communities that are more isolated, there's actually a greater sense of Jewish connection. So even if there are only 5 teens in that community, they do know each other and they are ready to hang out with each other and they're ready to spend time at the rabbi's house for Shabbat lunch or, together for an evening. So first of all, that sense of community is often stronger in our smaller cities sometimes than in our larger communities. So I don't know, but it may still be a plus in places like Omaha to have that local connection, and especially the rabbi making that time is really valuable. But then you're right. I think there's a tremendous opportunity now to be able to equalize those experiences. I know for my own kids, relationships they have online are they think of them equally to the ones that they have in person, right? For one of my kids, for example, moving into COVID space wasn't really so different. He was already online every night with a group of friends, playing different games, just hanging out, doing that kind of stuff. That was his college experience. And when he moved home, it just continued. And from his perspective, he has a very vibrant social life. It just happens to be online. And so for folks in more isolated communities, this could actually be a great blessing because they can this is a natural habitat, for folks that age, and they can create very healthy relationships, even with folks in different parts of the continent. So other than time zones, it's not actually, and since, kids seem to like staying up in weird hours anyway, that's what teens do, they can even manage those, pretty well. So it's actually a great opportunity. And by the way, it's not just limited to USY. We have to think about what does that mean for Jewish education? Now that we understand that there are compelling models for being able to educate, and to learn online. What does that mean, for example, for religious school education? Like, can we have, I would have great teens who did amazing things in my congregation, and then they'd move to Binghamton, New York, or to, College Station, Pennsylvania, to go to a large university, and there isn't a Jewish community that they can actually work in and engage, right? But in this day and age, like, those same folks could stay completely connected to my congregation and continue to teach and to tutor and to have those connections with students if that's part of their piece, or they could be hired by the movement to do Jewish education in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in places in Wisconsin. Like, they could find jobs all over the country and stay connected, earning money while they're going to school. So we could have some of the best Jewish educators available to anybody across the continent. Doesn't really matter, where you are. So those are the kinds of big picture pieces that the movement has to start thinking about. What are those opportunities? So USY is one space, but Jewish education, adult learning. There are a lot of spaces where we have to think about what are the opportunities we have across the continent versus what's something that local congregations may want to create, in a really strong way. And what's the balance between those pieces?
You have the unique experience of being the first executive leader of both the Rabbinical Assembly and of USCJ, which for movement insiders is a big deal. for people that don't pay much attention to movement politics and institutional structures and so forth, they're probably not even aware of it. Tell us a little bit about that. What are the opportunities that that you saw specifically to take on that role, but also that the leadership of these two large, influential, historic institutions of conservative Judaism saw by combining resources and coming closer together in terms of a shared vision, mission, values, and priorities?
So first of all, I love the way you introduced it, which is to say, like, if you were an insider in our institutions, you would be surprised by this. And if you weren't, you might not be so impressed. And I think that's partly the point, which is that I've one major critique I've had about our movement for a while now is that we're not really a movement. We've been a collection of institutions, each basically looking out for our own constituency, and in many cases doing that quite well, but not really thinking of ourselves as an integrated whole.
I called it a confederacy when I was there.
Yeah, exactly, as opposed to a union, right? So I don't want to take sides, but if there were a side to take,
I'm in Canada, so it's a different thing, right? It's like,
I would prefer, but what does it mean? So first of all, the paradigm, which is instead of being, in silos or in individual spaces, the paradigm of partnership is really important, right? In our congregations, we want clergy, professional staff, and lay leaders to all have a common set of goals and to be collaborating to create the strongest community experience possible within their synagogue. So what does it mean for us to want that from a synagogue, or from other community spaces and not have it in the movement space, right? The fact is, 80% of the time, that is happening in our congregations. But our institutional structures, especially the relationship between the rabbis and the synagogue space on the movement level, the institutional level, was really modeled on the 20% where that relationship was more complicated and it wasn't always working, right? There's still a need sometimes for rabbis to have an advocate and for congregational leaders to have an advocate to figure out an issue. But the fact is, I'd rather be in the 80% space than the 20% space. So that's number one. Number two, we have to be, in the 21st century, we have to be focused completely on impact. We have to be thinking about what is the way that we can be in relationship with people who want to be, who are open to being in our communities and experiencing our Torah. What are the opportunities that we have and how can we act on those opportunities? We cannot really afford to spend a lot of time thinking about our own institutional space and worrying about those politics. We wasted, I think, the better part of 2 decades worrying about that instead of taking advantage of the kinds of impact that we could have. So we should always be thinking about what's the impact we could have, how could we do that, and then how can we structure ourselves to make sure we're doing that, rather than the other way around. If our institutions need to change, they'll change. Right now, what we talk about for USCJ and the RA is we're in alignment. In other words, we have a common set of goals, which is to support our congregations, support our rabbis, and try to also reach folks who are not yet part of our communities, but who are open to our kind of Torah, and Jewish life. If we can find, and we will align our staffs and budgets any way that we need to in order to make that work happen. So that's going to take some time to realign and to figure out how to do that and to find the additional resources we need to do that. But over time, we'll figure that out. The third piece that I think is really valuable is that they are 2 very different institutions, the USCJ and the RA. One is about congregations in North America, and the other is rabbis who are serving in lots of different settings, not just congregations. 40 to 50% of RA rabbis serve in other places. They are in organizations, they are serving on campuses, they are entrepreneurs, they are teachers and educators in day schools and in other schools, right? So we can bring all of those folks much more closely in alignment with the rest of the work that we're doing in our synagogues and learn. And also the RA is global and connects us with rabbis and communities all over the world. So we can actually truly reinforce that sense of being a much broader movement, thinking about all the different spaces in which we create impact and how do we integrate those and help them feed on each other and create an ecosystem that actually supports one another instead of competes with one another. So it's a really important piece. The fourth thing is that it helps us really understand diversity. Canadian Judaism in Canada, Judaism in Toronto looks different than Judaism in Western Canada in some cases. Certainly looks different than Southern California, than New York, Florida, or Jerusalem. And the fact that the RA has this sense of global experience, that our own movement has lots of different expressions around the world, can help us actually strengthen our own sense of being a movement among our synagogues too, where we can understand that what synagogues in Toronto might do probably looks very different than what synagogues in Southern California do, and that's all part of the strength of our movement, not a weakness. We all believe in the same Torah. We all roughly approximate the same ways that we think about change in terms of halakha and Jewish practice, but we come to different conclusions because our Judaism talks about the idea that Judaism actually does evolve in time and space in different ways. And I think that the bringing together of both organizations helps us learn from each other, in terms of that, and we'll create more diversity rather than less.
Has the partnership between the RA and USCJ resulted in greater partnerships with other arms and segments of the movement? And what are those?
So absolutely. I mean, just 2 off the bat in the last few months. So for example, USCJ and the RA came together with the Canners Assembly and NASA, which is the executive directors, and the JEA, which is our educators, to create a task force around the high holidays. And we created all sorts of resources. We created a website, cjhighholidays.com, where we could bring all sorts of resources in each of those areas together, post them, and help congregations share with one another to be better prepared for the holidays. And over half of our congregations use that on a regular basis, and 95% of those who used it found it either helpful or very helpful. So we know that it's making an impact, and and the partnership was terrific. We also learned some things about it. It was one of our first broader partnerships. Now we're doing an additional partnership with the Ziegler Rabbinical School in Los Angeles and JTS, together with the RA and USCJ, around adult learning. We've got 130 congregations across the country, across the continent, who are tuning in to 4 sessions, either from the Ziegler School, the JTS faculty, or both. And we've got over 1,000 students across the country tuning in every week for the past 2 weeks, and now for another 2 weeks to come, to learn from some of the best scholars in our movement. And that was like thrown together right during the holidays, publicized right after the holidays. So some of our synagogues didn't even realize that it was taking place, which was fine because it was just a prototype to figure out how to do it. And now I've had other congregations say, oh, I didn't even know about that. Are you doing it again in January? And we are, and we will make sure that that
Yeah.
invitation gets even
I
more
was one of
notice.
those that missed that one because of the stress of the holidays. It's
For
like,
sure, for sure. And we knew it. We knew, but we also figured we didn't want to wait, right?
right,
And
of
also
course.
like you start small and then we
Right.
start to build. There are going to be some congregations who realize that nobody from their shul actually signed up. Others where they had 20 or 30 people and they loved it. It's also a great marriage, by the way, Steve, between that local piece and the continental piece, right? Because we could both take we could bring our resources across the continent, but many of congregations are having a discussion session with their rabbi right after the session, sometimes with coffee or something else in hand, and and being able to actually be hyper local, as well, which is it's a great modality.
Um, so I have to ask it, even though this is, I know when I was in your shoes, this was a question that like, in some ways it's a klutz kasha, and that is, whether the movement, um, you know, um, I'm curious to see your take on the answer of that to that question. I always, prided myself on the fact that on the one hand, I was the CEO of one of the um, anchor institutions of the movement, but I felt always that we spent too much time talking about the movement and not enough about the Judaism, and that we have to, we have to change the way in which we measure success. That it's not by membership, but it's really by impact. And I'm curious as to what your take is on that, and what are the steps that the RA and USCJ are doing in order to respond to that both internal and external criticism as to the state of the conservative movement, as opposed to the state of conservative Judaism.
Yeah. So, when I think of wither, I only think of it with an H and not without an H. And, because it is important to think about the direction we're going. Movements are about moving somewhere, moving people somewhere, moving ourselves somewhere. I think for many of us, that's what our rabbinates represent, the idea that we want to be growing ourselves and our Jewish commitments, knowledge, and joy, and we want to be helping other people along that same journey and path. That's our focus. It's harder because it's easy to measure membership. It's much harder to measure quality and impact. Much harder. We have to take anecdotes. We have to think more about how we ask a question and how we go out and survey that impact. But the fact is, that's really what's important. I am absolutely convinced that our centrist form of Judaism is crucial to Jewish life. It doesn't mean that that other forms of Judaism, from Reform to Orthodox, Reconstructing Judaism, Renewal, all of those also have an important role to play. I think that's an important thing to keep in mind in the 21st century. We're not about dominating a market or saying we're better or more important than anybody else. But do I think that there is a space for a Judaism that believes that we authentically evolve and grow and adapt halakha and Jewish practice to maintain a sense of community and commitment and meaning, in the 21st century? I know that there is always a place for that. We think of ourselves as being among the authentic inheritors. I don't want to say the only one, but I will say, to me personally, among the most authentic ways to bring rabbinic Judaism into the 21st century. We inherit that tremendous tradition. We build on it. We build on it in an organic, evolving way. We don't reform it, and we also don't ossify it. We continue to help it grow and mature. And I know that there are millions of Jews and Jewish adjacent people out there who will find meaning in it if we can learn to adapt it, grow it, and think about how we create that impact in people's lives. And all of the structures around our movement can follow that rather than dictate it.
Thank you, Rabbi, for sharing just a half hour with us. We'll have, I hope, many more opportunities to learn with you and to hear from you. And certainly you should consider Bet Tzedek as a member of USCJ, and our clergy who are members of the Rabbinical Assembly and of the Cantors Assembly as allies. We look forward to furthering this vision into the future, and wish you Bahatzacha Rabbah.
We think of you not just as allies, but as true partners in the work. Reb Steve, you are a tremendous partner, as are all of your clergy partners at Beth Tzedek, and your congregation is just an incredible partner and wonderful member of USCJ. We so appreciate it, and I appreciate the invitation to speak together. It's great to be in conversation.
To find out all the other ways, activities, programs, and opportunities to be spiritually near while we're physically distant with Beth Tzedek, and of course with conservative Judaism and our movement, be sure to check us out online, www.beth-tzedec.org. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Have a wonderful day.